7 in the morning. This is the kind of fire we've got burning.
There's an airfield. Damn. Nuclear bombers have been attacked by hundreds of missiles. Flamingos and drones struck. At Engels, the airfield was blown up, strategic aircraft and missile depots were destroyed. Thousands injured, the fires can't be put out. We will show exclusive footage and details right now. Hundreds of new Flamingo missiles have been launched across Russia.
Just panicked.
Bases and oil depots are burning, and this is just the beginning. And as the cherry on top, it was blown up again. The Druzhba oil pipeline. Something is burning in the center. The walls are shaking for Muscovites.
Here's the column of smoke. That's why it's shaking at our place. Then all the walls were already shaking.
Turn off the lights. You can't turn them on, they say, because they're flying towards the heat. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetan right now. Friends, boom bada boom, Russians had their walls shaking. More than 200 drones attacked Russia, and in Engels, a military airfield was hit. Strategic bombers that attack Ukraine were damaged, as well as depots with Fabis, Kabis, and cruise missiles. Moreover, it is reported that KH-555 and KH-101 missiles for the Tu-95 and Tu-160 have been damaged. In Kuban, Russia, the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station has been burning for almost 2 days now after a drone attack. The GUR successfully attacked Russian targets in temporarily occupied Crimea. Air defense systems, naval vessels, and the helicopter were hit, and 13 Russian radar stations were destroyed. But Russia also claims that the armed forces of Ukraine attempted to break through into the Belgorod region. What is known about this? We will discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svetan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish everyone good health.
Dear audience, please like this video and write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments. Roman Grigorievich, how many bombers were damaged? Because, according to the information I have, there were several bombers there and one IL, which delivered missiles. Here it says, in the morning, an IMS IL-76 arrived at the base, likely delivering a new batch of missiles, A101. And in Engels, there were 3 Tu-95MS and 2 Tu-160. What do you say?
Well, they were definitely damaged. The question is, to what extent? Why? Because there was a large-scale attack, both with drones and most likely with a missile. That explosion, since it was an explosion, was caused by a fifth element that pierced the roof. If anyone remembers that movie, it was probably one of our missiles, not ruling out the possibility that even a long-range Neptune was used in that direction. And naturally, the detonation that occurred after the strike and the detonation of missiles, aerial bombs, and small arms ammunition that are loaded into aircraft, among other things. Naturally, the planes parked nearby were damaged as well. There was no way they could have avoided being damaged. The question is, to what extent were they damaged? I believe that within just a few days, our intelligence, our general staff will confirm it after gathering information from satellites and images, decoding them. In other words, using objective monitoring tools. And then we'll be able to celebrate once again. Maybe in the next stream, we'll be able to confirm this with you more precisely.
Roman Nikolaevich, what could have been hit? The bombers themselves, the storage facility with cruise missiles, and the aviation fuel depot. These elements were the targets for Ukraine's armed forces, our missiles, and our drones.
Any strategic bomber base is, to put it simply, very much like a large self-sustaining city, where in addition to the airfield itself, a truly huge amount of complex support infrastructure is constantly involved in daily operations. A large number of infrastructure facilities of various types, starting with underground fuel storage tanks holding tens of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene, and ending with some of those same warehouses. And SIS, which is especially important, is the special engineering service for missile preparation and, of course, the storage of aviation bombs and missiles used by these strategic bombers. By the way, they are still far away and not many people talk about this. But south of Engels, several dozen kilometers away, on the left bank of the Volga, there is another facility, the so-called Saratov 63. This is a nuclear storage site, or more precisely, a storage facility for nuclear warheads for strategic and tactical aviation. In other words, there are significant stockpiles located there. Of the 12th GUMO, the 12th main directorate of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, specifically for tactical nuclear weapons. So Just a few dozen kilometers, and the mushroom cloud would not be like the one over Engels there. It would be a truly massive one. And as for Kazakhstan, the Kazakhs would have already seen it. It's a pity, really. I have too many friends in Kazakhstan, so of course I feel sorry for them to disappoint them like that. But nevertheless, this is such a serious facility that to take it out, not just with missiles or drones, to level it completely, you'd need several squadrons of bombers carpet bombing the area. But if you blow up this underground fuel storage, let me repeat, we're talking about tens of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene, which is used by strategic bombers. A single bomber like the Tu-160 takes on board the equivalent of 3 railway tank cars of this kerosene. They fill more than 150 tons of aviation kerosene there. And for the Tu-95, it is 1 railway tank car, which is also quite a lot. So there is a reason to strike there. A hit that could be delivered to this entire facility could be catastrophic for the Russians. By the way, it was to Engels that we once handed over our bombers, the Tu-160, the Tu-95, and the Tu-22, as well as our Cossack 55s. Back then, under Kuchma, hundreds of missiles were handed over. It was former President Leonid Kuchma himself who was dealing with this, at least back in the day. And now we're going to try to dismantle and completely destroy, essentially, the very same strategic bombers that we once handed over to the Russian Federation. So specifically, what exactly was hit? That will become clear within a few days, once the satellite images have been analyzed.
Roman Igorovich, how many military personnel are usually stationed at such air bases, airfields, military ones?
The thing is, they perform different tasks, and the area involved also varies. There should be at least a regiment stationed there, that's for sure. About 1,500 Russian servicemen should be involved in this process. 1,500 to 2,000.
Could we have eliminated enemy personnel with these strikes, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, definitely 100%. The thing is, even SIIS, that's the engineering and technical service, a special engineering service, and of course the security and defense of the facility itself, the storage of missiles. Missiles aren't stored like matches. There are even certain specific mechanisms involved. There are climate control systems, especially for missiles of this type. So several dozen people were definitely taken out, and the remaining hundreds were certainly cleared out by this strike. Believe me, the shockwave was there, just like in Syria.
Roman Igorovich, indeed, right now the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station has been burning for almost a day after the drone attack, and everyone is talking about the long Neptune, the modified missile. Let's discuss this missile, as well as the strikes on oil refineries, bases, and on Kavkazskaya, which has been burning for almost 2 days now.
The sanctions of Malyuk and Budanov have now become the sanctions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Why? Because in such strikes, including the strike on Engels, the security service of Ukraine and special operations forces were naturally involved. That's the minimum. And probably also the Navy, if Neptune was used, since it's a coastal missile system with a launch platform. At the very least, they are being used. But I think within a day it will become clear. Long, Neptune long, it's the same situation, meaning it's a launch. It is launched from a coastal missile system. Naturally, the Navy is involved in this. The main targets for this kind of cruise missile are objects that need to be penetrated. For example, a 150 kilogram warhead is definitely not the same as the 20 kilograms on a drone, or 50, or however much they carry. And the warhead, that is a 150 kilogram warhead, can reach its target and detonate, as we are seeing now, supposedly, let's say for now, supposedly, a warehouse with missiles and aerial bombs was blown up in Engels. Naturally, the same warhead could be used against TWAPs or to breach their detonation systems, or at the pumping stations. This is one of the main objectives. Right now for us, God forbid it gets stopped. Now, all these representatives, not from our government, are running around with the idea of how to secure Russia's hydrocarbon industry. So God forbid these strikes are stopped like they were last year. If last year in May, the sanctions against Malyuk and Budanov hadn't been stopped, there wouldn't be any this year, because there would be nothing left to destroy. We would have just burned everything to the ground over the past year. Now it turns out they're trying to stop these strikes. The missile is very good. It's a basic missile. Ours, the Neptune, has the long or Neptune, but it's a basic missile, also the KH-35. At one time, it was also produced at our facility. Our engines for this missile, turbojet engines, dual circuit missiles, it was air to ship. That's its main purpose, meaning it's an anti-ship system. The missile, which was later was upgraded to be able to strike ground targets, and with a good engine and additional fuel tanks, it can now cover more than 500 kilometers. So at the very least, it has reached a range of 500 kilometers. I think regarding Engels, it could have been used there too, because they practically opened up a warehouse that was sealed. These missiles are not just lying around outside. In other words, it was sealed, and since it was breached, it most likely means a missile got in. But there is no confirmation yet, so we won't confirm it either for now. This is just an analytical note.
Roman Nikolaevich, just to clarify for our audience, what is the range of this missile and what new possibilities does this open up for us? Let's make sure we record this now.
Well, the range of the missile, at least the confirmed one, is definitely 500 to 600 kilometers. We've seen this with Tuapse and maybe now with Engels as well. Yes, Engels is a little over 600 kilometers away. That's the actual stated range. So what does that mean? 500 to 600 kilometers? That's like a semicircle from Moscow through Engels to Tuapse. Just draw that circle. That's everything we can reliably hit with this missile. But the stated range is 1,000 kilometers. You could, for example, set a compass at St. Petersburg and draw a semicircle almost reaching the Caucasus. So that would already cover areas closer to Kazakhstan. To the east, it would reach beyond the Volga, at least past Engels and Astrakhan, closer to Kazakhstan. And to the south, this missile would reach the North Caucasus, if the stated range matches the actual flight range. Technically, that's possible. Overall, the engine is very good. Our engine, the one we manufacture, will definitely run for an hour, and the missile's speed is 850 kilometers per hour. But running for an hour or an hour and a half is not a problem. The main thing is the fuel. That is, it depends on how many extra buckets you fill up. The missile will fly as far as the amount of fuel you put in it.
So Moscow, St. Petersburg, and military infrastructure targets could be attacked?
Well, definitely they're already under serious targeting. And in order to fully accomplish our objectives, let's say for the security of our border, we need to reach about 2,000 kilometers. Roughly speaking, we need to reach as far as the Urals. It's 2,000 kilometers to the Urals. But as for cruise missiles, it's hardly worth it, for example, to make cruise missiles with such a range right now. Ideally, of course, either drones, they're a bit cheaper, or ballistic missiles. So for this kind of range, either solid fuel or liquid fuel, in other words, ballistic missiles. I think we won't resolve this issue this year, but rather next year. Roman Nikolaevich?
There's more good news. The main intelligence directorate successfully attacked Russian targets in occupied Crimea. Air defense systems came under attack, as did naval vessels and a helicopter. 13 Russian radar stations were hit, including the one L-125, NIOBSV, NEBSV, and Brals-Mayes. How do you assist the work of the main intelligence directorate? As I understand it, all of this was done over a certain period of time, and it has now been documented.
Yes, this took place over several months. Definitely, this is the work of Gersbex and Meger. The main intelligence directorate and the security service, their own backs, practically, they turned unmanned boats into aircraft carriers. Both of them did it. Both the GUARS Magura and the SBU Saibeb. Now they can operate almost like aircraft carriers carrying unmanned aerial vehicles. Specifically UAVs, drones. They can carry both surface and underwater drones, meaning they can function as a mothership and a relay station at the same time. Here we have a specialized maritime boat measuring several meters in total length and a certain significant width that is fully capable of taking multiple unmanned aerial vehicles on board, for example, and then it can slowly approach the rugged coast of Crimea, or perhaps somewhere else on Russian territory, getting much closer to the port of Novorossiysk. And just a few kilometers from the shore, it can launch drones under direct control using the boat itself as a relay station. The guys can carry out a combat mission just like they do directly with, say, those same FPV drones. That is, from a certain point, the drone, let's call it B-Plashka, takes off. And then it destroys a Russian radar system, takes out an anti-aircraft missile complex or some other military target, depending on its capabilities. Plus, especially the GUARS Magura drones can also carry C-2 air missiles, depending on the launch configuration. This is the R-73 air-to-air missile, an excellent missile. It's already half a century old. Thousands have been produced, and we have thousands of them. It has a heat-seeking homing head. If you aim it and the missile locks on, it will chase down the target. And if there are two missiles on the Maguras, two missiles, that means they can also destroy aerial targets. Here is confirmation of a helicopter being destroyed. Actually, more than one. One was completely destroyed and the second was seriously damaged. So in this sense, the Duar operators have practically become naval aviators, I would say. They entered a field that isn't typical for them and performed quite well there. And the security service under Malyuk, that is the GUR under Budanov's leadership and the SBU under Malyuk's leadership, they practically covered the entire spectrum. Now they use almost the full range of strike weapons, and what's important is that they produce them at their own facilities. These are intelligence agencies working on their own bases at their own expense. After all, their budgets are rather small. These are not the armed forces of Ukraine, not Umarov's forces with billions or hundreds of billions in funding. Instead, they managed to find sponsors on their own, most likely, and perhaps even accomplish this kind of task. Well, good for them. There's nothing more to say.
Tamanyagovich, before we talk with you about the Belgorod region and the information from Russian war correspondents, I would like you to give a brief overview of the Ukrainian missile system Hrom-2. What are its potential capabilities, and how should these capabilities be used? Please, the floor is yours.
To understand the process, what is the Hrom-2? It's essentially the same as the Iskander. In terms of range, warhead, and control system, it's just like the Iskander. We have one like that. Several decades ago, a good project called Sapson was launched. Based on this Sapson, a solid-fuel ballistic missile system was developed for the Hroms. And naturally, this project produced results. That is, work was done on this project. Now we have Hrom-1 and Hrom-2. We made it with a range of 300 kilometers and sold it with an audit, by the way, including with Saudi money. We sold it along with the technical documentation. But most likely, the intervention of our partners made it possible for us to at least get the technical documentation back. Maybe some launchers, maybe even some missiles. I wouldn't rule that out, including that. So you could say that Hrom-2 is basically the same as the Iskander. 500 kilometers Moscow. That's what the OSCE refers to with these 500 kilometers. That is, if there are enough ballistic missiles, then Rubliovka is within reach. Do you remember back in the day when we talked about how it would be better for the Rubliovka export ladies to stay far away from those accountants? The bathhouses where the main decisions are made about the further conduct of military operations in Russia. Why? Because the first Hrom should definitely bury Lenin. Because how much longer does he have to lie there after all? The Kremlin is the first target and the second is Rubliovka, or on the contrary, depending on preference. Maybe Rubliovka will actually be the first to go.
Roman Nikolaevich, now of course, this information which has been circulating for several days in Russian propaganda channels and among Russian war correspondents, because in Russia they are claiming that the armed forces of Ukraine are attempting to break through into the Belgorod region. What is known about this? Let's analyze it.
To understand the situation, we have about 600 kilometers of border if you do not count the curves, but just the straight border between Belarus. And the fragment is between Ukraine and Russia. On our side, that's the Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions. Yes, that fragment. On the Russian side, it's the Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod regions. So our main task is to turn this borderline into a front line, because that's the right and smart thing to do. Yes, to change the architecture of the front, to open the northern front. It's already open since we started moving into the Kursk region. The Kursk direction towards Moscow is called that by some extremely delusional idiots. As part of the main task of tying down the enemy, several tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were pinned down there. And of course, the creation of the so-called security zone, buffer zone, people call it differently. You could call it a support zone if it's a front line and a mine strip, about 30 kilometers. We need to create such a security zone, a demilitarized area deep inside Russian territory, but the Russians denazify it. They immediately start bombarding it with aerial bombs, artillery, and evacuate the civilian population from there. So such a buffer zone can be created not even by advancing 30 kilometers. You can go in 3, 5, 7 kilometers, but onto Russian territory, mining not our land, but Russian territory. If you lay several 100,000 mines there, they'll be digging them out for 100 years, if they even bother at all. And naturally, army artillery can add another 25 kilometers to the creation of such a buffer zone beyond the initial 30 kilometers. In the Kursk direction, we created it, we accomplished it. The only retreat, we've already talked about this, the withdrawal was almost catastrophic because it was untimely. A decision was made to withdraw and redeploy into defensive What we're doing now in the Belgorod region is essentially the same kind of operation, only not as deep, without an operational breakthrough. It's a tactical operation involving an incursion and the creation of such a buffer zone on Belgorod territory, taking up the best defensive positions. The thing is, there's a difference in elevation. This is the so-called central Russian upland. The difference in height is about 50 to 70 meters. Just to give you an idea, between the hills, so for example, the rivers or small streams there, they're at about 140 meters above sea level, while the tops of these uplands are around 220 to 230 meters. So these elevation changes, it's best to take control of the high ground, no matter where they are, whether on our side or the Russian side. If there's an opportunity to move into Russian territory to improve defensive positions, that's the task that's carried out. Right now, this task is being carried out in the Demidovka area, in the Belgorod direction. Well, the first issue is, of course, the creation of this kind of buffer zone. The second issue is to try to intercept Russian reserves that are now being freed up from the Kursk direction. As we withdraw along the borderline, they will be redeployed to the eastern front. So to prevent them from reaching the Pokrovsky direction, they have about 2 divisions there. Maybe that's it. Almost 30,000 Russian troops could now be redeployed from the Kursk area, heading toward the eastern front. They will be passing right through, or rather along and through the Belgorod region, and that's why we need to intercept them. Right now, I think there is such pressure being created in the Belgorod region, and at least for the near future, there is a positive trend. Of course, we can't discuss tactical matters even if we knew them. You just can't disclose tactical information on air, but in reality, I think in a week we'll be able to talk about the results of this. This is the Putin'S operation.
The Russians claim to have allegedly shot down an F-16 over the Sumy region. The Air Force has already debunked this fake news. So what? Andriy Demchenko reports that Russians are storming the border of the Sumy region on ATVs. New Su aircraft are destroying their groups. What do you say, Roman Hryhorovich?
Well, they got scared by the information that came out a few days ago. There was a really good video sequence showing the use of F-16s over Sumy. Naturally, the Russian psychological operations work differently. In fact, from the standpoint of logic and action, they responded correctly. Our own CPD and CPSO teams should take this as an example as well. After all, FSB and KGB officers have been conducting these psychological special operations for 100 years. And they needed to carry out such a psychological operation because it really put a lot of pressure on the Russians. The appearance of the F-16 as practically right at the line of contact, flying at extremely low altitudes, was executed. Their combat missions most likely involved dropping certain munitions below the radar horizon of Russian air defenses. Naturally, no one could get to it, and this put pressure on the Russians in that direction. Of course, they had to counteract it, so they made up the story that they shot down another F-16 in that area. Believe me, no one shot anything down. I have friends, quite a few of them, who would have shared any information if something had happened. I can confidently say that no one shot anything down. The guys are working along the entire line of contact, both on F-16s and Mirages. They've already gone out on combat missions, carrying out tasks in those directions where it's possible, based on the density of the enemy's air defenses. And based on our own capabilities to cover these aircraft, God's due. So go ahead and fill in the rest yourselves so I don't have to swear too much. So this so-called God's due in Trump's eyes, which was orchestrated by Putin. For what purpose? Well, in order to create a certain amount of pressure. The Ukrainian side, it's the same thing, an IPSO, an information psychological special operation in which the top officials of the state are involved. This is a serious operation. For what purpose? In order to give the Russian population primarily, and of course Trump and those regarding Ukraine, a chance to try to suppress, to paint some alternative picture of the real events on, we're holding the line on the Kursk land and the launch as well, and no one is surrounded there. We're holding on, and the retreat was a retreat, indeed a belated flight. If a month and a half ago, as we said, there had been an organized withdrawal, then it would have been a controlled retreat to defensive positions. This was a flight, but still to defensive lines located on Russian territory. The difference is, for example, the Sudza River in Kursk, well, along the Kurshina, which flows there, the Pereplyuika stream, but its elevation above sea level is 140 meters. Nearby, further south, the elevation is already about 220 meters. So here, there's at least a 50 to 70 meter difference in elevation, and this is Kursk land. And on these heights, our units that withdrew from the Sudza direction have taken up positions. And at the moment, no one intends to retreat any further. Naturally, the Russians need to show that they're surrounded there, that everything is lost. Boss, the client is leaving, the cast is coming off, everything's lost, and so on. They're trying to cut us off, but they're still very far from encircling us. It's simply unrealistic because these ridges run along the borderline. That's where our troops are positioned naturally. I don't think we'll be leaving Kursk land. There's a good defensive line there. And the Russians who are trying to cut off our direction have gotten stuck in the Basovka area. So yes, this is the Sumy region, meaning it's Sumy territory, and it's just a few kilometers from the borderline. That's all there is to it. They're trying to somehow break through to cut off the supply to this group. But in the information space, to somehow ramp up the pressure, well, Putin threw out some platitudes, let's put it mildly, towards Trump, and now Trump is just mirroring them. What else can he do? Right now, he's tied to Putin, to his non-involvement in that adventure they started together with Netanyahu in the Middle East. Once again, there are strikes against the Houthis, against Gaza, against Lebanon, against Syria. Naturally, if the Russians decide to make their weighty statement there, it won't end well for anyone. That's for sure. Most likely, strikes against Iran in the Middle East are ahead, and Trump has been dragged into them, and now they have nowhere to go. Well, Witkov got involved, and after all, he's such a great Israeli-American, or American-Israeli. That's why Russian oil refineries of all kinds and levels will keep burning. Maybe not with the same intensity, and it will be presented a bit differently. Not sanctions or the Ukrainian defense forces, but the work of the local underground at various levels. I think that, by the way, this kind of work by our informants can be just as effective. Just like now with the Ukrainian defense forces. Believe me, tens of millions of Ukrainians will definitely not stop fighting for their land, for their sovereignty, for their territorial integrity. And several million residents of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, you won't be able to turn them around no matter what.
Dear audience, please like this video and write a few kind words in the comments to support the armed forces of Ukraine. Share your thoughts about this situation as a whole. Renowned analyst Roman Svetan, Roman Grigorievich, thank you. And as always, see you next week.
Goodbye.